This is a paper I've completed together with my colleague, with a former student of mine, Laurence Vigneault, and Michael Johnson-Kramer from Bucknell University. So here the framing is quite different, and the type of puzzle we want to address is a little bit broader. We're interested in the process whereby whereby measures or something, a measure become related to a concept. And we're interested in particular into how a concept and a specific type of measure become aligned over time. So nowadays, few of you in the room would contest that temperature, for instance, is measured with a thermometer. But actually, if you look at what was the definition of temperature in medieval times, you could see that in medieval times, people would define temperature as something that was related to your mood, to your bodily aspects, and it took quite a lot of time to find an agreement and a consensus about what is a temperature. And to a large extent, what we define as temperature is what is measured by a thermometer. So in a sense, if you don't develop the technique and the tool of measurement, usually you're not able to refine your concept in a way so that it becomes useful from an academic viewpoint. And you can see that for temperature. You can see exactly the same thing if you read the history of quantification or the sociology of quantification for things such as time. And again, in medieval times, hours were not the same length during a day because people were dividing the time of daylight and the church was ringing the bell to indicate you that it was time for praying, and you would stop working and start praying and so on. So to a large extent, the type of technology you have in order to measure or define something tend to shape the way we approach it from a theoretical viewpoint. So that's a broad issue that has been studied by quite a lot of sociologists in France, especially after the work of Luc Boltanski, who was interested in how specific statistical categories start taking a life of their own, and in particular a strange category that was invented by INSEE in the 60s, which was called the cadre, which was a catch-all category created in order to analyze different professions. That has been created by INSEE people, which is the French Statistical Institute, for all the people who didn't have any clear profession that fit within the other categories. And this catch-all category, after a while, become a category for describing middle manager type of people. And you could see a few dozens of years later, special issue in magazine about what les cadres think about this or think about that. And under the influence of Pierre Bourdieu and Desrosières, quite a lot of statisticians in France started being interested in the social life of categories and statistics. So that's a little bit the story I want to tell here, but about ESG ratings. So where are these ESG ratings we are using in our computer, in our software, in our data analysis coming from? And why and how is it possible that the data that has been produced by practitioners for a slightly different purpose than conducting research becomes suddenly something regarded as acceptable in the academic context as an accepted measure of corporate social responsibility or corporate social performance or ESG, up to the point that we have even MSCI representatives in the room with a stand, and they even contribute to finance or conference. So we can really see that this KLD dataset has become mainstream. So I think it's an important question because economists in the past warned us that we should not let data dictate how we do research and the type of question we inquire. And however, if you look at the development of academic research on CSR, you will see that it tends to follow quite a lot the availability of different data sets as people are rushing to regret them on different categories. And this has been a huge problem in the field of business and society of CSR, which was described by Ullman in the mid-80s after Pirandello as empirical data in search of an adequate theory. So here it's not character searching for an author, but data searching for theorization and publication, maybe. So how new database or new data set become accepted as appropriate measure of a given concept? That's the question we're interested in. And in order to look at that, we've derived our insights from different literature. So there are two basic literatures and one which is about diffusions of innovation, diffusions of practice. You may have heard about that. There are lots of models in marketing in particular. But the one I'm more interested in is a model that opposes or contrasts the model of diffusion that usually you look at how people adopt a given technology, and then after you try to construct curves to look at the accumulation of adoption over time. But in a sense, you arrive after the war. Like people have already adopted the technology when you start doing your measure and developing your model. And for some sociologists, what is interesting is why do people in the first place adopt the measure, and how has the measure been translated in such a way that it becomes their problem to use it in order to solve a specific practical problem at a given point in time. And they oppose a model of translation to this concept of diffusion in order to analyze that. I think these two, in particular, actor network theory scholars have used that, and one of their motto is to adopt is to adapt. And actually, if you look at people using different type of things, and that's true also for consumer products, usually you tend to parameter it differently, to use it for other purpose, and some of the most successful marketing innovation usually are products that were launched for very different purpose and that have been used by consumers for other reasons than the ones they were designed or intended by their designer. So what we have learned from the diffusion perspective, if we applied it to the case of a data set, is the fact that the property of the object is supposed to explain the reason why you're going to rush on it, because it's a good data set. Here we could see and challenge that in the case of KLD, especially at the beginning. There were not a lot of alternatives, but there were some technical issue. They have also suggested people working in this literature that usually it's not academic innovating and practitioners following them, but it's rather quite often academics following what practitioners think at a given point in time. And there is a whole literature on fad and fashion that tend to suggest that what is published, for instance, in Harvard Business Review will become what is published in more mainstream journals in management or in finance the later years. And that's rarely the other way around. And I think this literature is also interesting because it suggests that there are different categories of use and reason for adoption. You can use an innovation because it's practical. You can use it because you look good by using it for symbolic reason. Or you can use it because it helps you thinking differently about things, and that's a more conceptual category of use. If you look at the translation side, or what's underlying those activities, here you will have different types of stories, and authors in sociology working in this perspective will put the emphasis on the role of materiality. So here the idea is that something has been translated in a way which is practical for you and that fits the way you're working. For instance, the MSCI data is presented or shaped in such a way that you can put it easily in your software. So that is going to create some affordance for you, and that will make your life easier as a statistician or as an economist or as a financial scholar. According to this literature also, when something becomes successful, it becomes a black box. So ideally, you want people to use something without understanding what's in it. And that's a kind of measure of success according to these scholars. When people start discussing and commenting on its content, it means it's not working or flying very well for that. And you can think about a lot of measurement tools, for instance, in art science or in biology that have been developed. When people start questioning whether a microscope actually measure what it is supposed to measure, it's not going to be very good for the scholars relying on that tool. And finally, according to this literature, there are important episodes in academic context, which are trial of strengths, where sometimes different people will fight to impose different tools or different data set in order to say, well, this is the right way of measuring a given concept. And here you will have an academic controversy. People will argue, people will discuss, and sometimes they will destroy your nice black box and force you to open it and to show that actually it's not as great as what it looks. For instance, there may be conflict of interest, captured by the data set indirectly, and that may bias some of your measure in your paper, if I reflect on the prior presentation. So that provides complementary insights in order to understand the process by which new data sets become incorporated within the academic community. And in that paper, we're looking at that by focusing on the case of KLD. KLD has been made available since the early 90s, and it is regarded, at least in the field of business and society, it was regarded as the best friend of the field in the early 2000s. And based on what I can see here, it is also a very good friend of our little academic community, and many papers were relying on MSCI or other data sets. So what we've done is that we've combined qualitative, quantitative techniques, not very sophisticated quantitative techniques, at least at this stage, mainly counting. And we've just extracted all the papers that mention KLD. So we will update with MSCI, but usually when people use MSCI, they also refer to the KLD dataset for a reason that I'm going to explain in a few minutes. And we've extracted about 600 papers. I need to update the dataset. We ended up in 2017 or 16, the analysis last time. And then we've done a systematic citation context analysis. So we were looking at how people in the text of their paper were using KLD, and which type of use do they do of the KLD data, if they use the KLD data. And after, we've tried to interview the people who have contributed to incorporate that data set in academia. So all the academics who have published the paper that was the first in their field relying in the data set. And we have asked them to reflect on the pushback from reviewer and the arguments they've used in order to convince their peers that the data was actually measuring the concept that they were assessing in their paper. So in so doing, we can progressively analyze how a data set is become aligned or related to a given concept, which was the question we were interested in the first place. So here, we're still interviewing actors using KLD and MSCI, and I'm glad I found some new interviewees in the panel, and there are probably some others also in the room. We focused very much on the early users, if you like, of the dataset, but that would be interesting for us also to get more insight about the rationale for using this dataset in more recent years. So I may get in touch with some of you if you're keen to be interviewed for this project. So then after we've started our data analysis, and we've started by using this typology about symbolic, conceptual, and practical uses of data. So practical uses of data is you use the KLD or the MSCI data in order to measure something, and you use concretely the data. Symbolic use, it means you're referring to the existence of this data set symbolically in order to do something else. For instance, to explain that another data set is similar, but not exactly similar, but sufficiently similar to be acceptable so that you can publish your paper. Or you use it at the conceptual side, and here we're becoming closer to this initial idea I was mentioning at the beginning with the thermometer. It means that the way you're going to define ESG or the way you're going to define corporate social performance is going to be aligned with the categories used by KLD rather than with some kind of academic concept that was published before. So then after we've done some statistics to analyze that, and we pay special attention to controversies around the use of KLD, and there have been quite a few of them. So if you look at the diffusion, and here, so these are data that we need to update, what we found interesting is that the first user of KLD were in the field of CSR in business and society. Then it becomes mainstream in management literature. Then it becomes used in other side literature in management accounting. You can see that people from finance have jumped quite late in the day on the data set in order to use it. And what is interesting, if you look at the support where the paper were published, it started in a relatively little journal field, CSR journal, such as Business and Society. And then after, there were a few papers, in particular in a special issue from Academy of Management Journal. And then the year after, in management, it became a data set used quite widely. So what is interesting is that here you can see also how the data set is diffusing from one discipline or one domain to another. And we end up to the situation today where it may become a mainstream thing in finance. Again, once again, thanks to the role we all together play in this little story. So here we were looking at the practical, symbolic, and conceptual use of the dataset over time. And what I found interesting is that you have quite a lot of symbolic use, especially at the later stage. And analyze that. I will explain the reason why there is that in more detail. So to us, it's an indicator of institutionalization of the dataset. you talk about it even if you don't use it, because it means something or it plays a purpose in order to legitimate something different in the field. And then using our interview, using the different results of the content of analysis, we've tried to develop a stage model looking at the development over time. So we found that there was this incubation stage, the publication of the first paper, including in this special issue of the Academy of Management Journal in 1999, then an expansion stage, and finally a consolidation stage. After we've looked at what took place and what did happen during these different phases, and what we found interesting is that at the beginning, people were trying to assemble the data set and considering it as a whole and problematizing the problem in the literature as the measure of corporate social responsibility. And corporate social responsibility or corporate social performance was regarded as a broad construct, including different stakeholders, that could be generally measured thanks to the KLD dataset, and typically by doing a difference between the strengths and the weaknesses and constructing an aggregated score. So that use of KLD and that kind of theorization involved quite a lot of work to problematize CSP measurement as the key problem of the thing, to construct this kind of black box saying that actually the dataset is measuring that construct. And there were lots of problems of aggregation, weighting, and connection with the broad concept that were solved across the different papers. But then a lot of people started in the field challenging that actually KLD was assessing corporate social performance. They were challenging the reliability and the validity of the dataset. And a lot of people started saying, well, you need to do some factor of analysis to understand and extract how the dataset is organized from the inside. And that's the second stage after this trial of strengths, where people have started unblackboxing or opening the black box to try to see how naturally the kind of dimensions of KLD will cluster. And the problem of that is that they didn't find anything that fits straightforwardly any kind of theoretical framework. So they had to do some kind of bricolage, talking about institutional social performance and technical social performance, because the factor analysis didn't give some great distinction that were very useful. And so the black box was becoming very weak, and people focused mainly at this stage on factor analysis type of things. Here you had this continuity of the validity and reliability challenge. And what has happened in the most recent period is that KLD subdimension and component are becoming regarded as acceptable measure of subdimension or narrower concept in different subfields within which is used. So for instance, the environmental data are going to be regarded as an appropriate measure in journals such as organizational and environment in order to assess one specific concept, but not CSR as a whole. And less scholars will try to reconstruct a global measure of corporate social performance. And that's the underlying work that explains how the data set is becoming incorporated within the process. So just to give you a few quotes illustrating the kind of problem. At the first stage, it was mainly about aggregation, about weighting, and people were developing very sophisticated weighting system in order to understand how to put together the data. And that relates to the fact that they wanted a unified measure of CSR or CSP. On the symbolic level, people were celebrating the fact we finally have a good data set in the field. Then if you look at the second stage, the problem become much more about trying to understand how to split the data set or using its different components, or instead of calculating differences between score, considering that strength and weaknesses are different categories of concept. At the conceptual level, the work become really trying to dimensionalize the data set. And at the symbolic level, more and more people use KLD as a justification in order to use another proxy or another dataset in the field. And this was something that became more and more obvious, especially in the neighboring fields than the fields of CSR. And at the third period, we had this reconstruction, or at least this abandon of the notion that we can measure CSR as a whole, and rather we need to focus on different subdimensions. And CSR is more regarded, or KLD is regarded more as a kind of benchmark that could legitimize or justify the use of other data sets in different fields. Even so, some people in CSR consider that there is a KLD type of research and start redefining a subfield around the KLD dataset. So basically, what are the contribution and implications of this analysis to conclude quickly the paper? First implication, we think that helps understanding the dynamics of knowledge building in management, organization studies, and probably also in sustainable finance, because we try to make explicit the work which is usually invisible because it takes place only in the context of peer review. So we don't know how and why a dataset became accepted, actually. It shows also that building a black box around the dataset is quite a demanding task, and that can be challenged at any moment. But I think the key message is maybe that we should be much more mindful of the way we use those kind of practitioner and secondary data, and try to make the work of how we align them with concept public, rather than hidden in the shadow of the reviewing process of the first papers using or relying on a given data set. And that would involve much more discussion with the data provider. So I'm quite glad that we have them in the room today. And finally, that shows also that that could be interesting to try to understand how our concept and construct evolve and emerge from the ground up through bottom-up processes, as I think that in the case of CSR and probably sustainable finance, we're much more driven by the available data than what we like to think as a scholar. So thank you for your time.